Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. And you know what they say, April comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb, right? Because it's snowing out right now. So let's see how we do. My paper is Bernard DeVoto's War in the West. Bernard Augustine DeVoto was born July 11, 1897, the son of lapsed Catholic father and lapsed Mormon mother. He said as a result of that, he really didn't believe in anything. Okay. DeVoto's parents, however, gave him a lot of affection and support, intellectual stimulation and grudging approval from a contrarian father, and adoration from a doting mother. His mother's death during the influenza epidemic of 1919 really plunged him into a deep depression for more than 2 years. From his father, he inherited a very hot temper. His dad's name was Florian. Florian DeVoto was a cynic, convinced that the world was composed of fools and liars. The adolescent DeVoto cast himself in the role really of a lone outsider, considered himself an intellectual superior and a fierce critic throughout his life of the Mormon establishment. His biographer, who many of you know, Wallace Stegner, described DeVoto as precocious, alert, intelligent, brash, challenging, irreverent, literary, self-conscious, insecure, crude, and often insufferable. The sister of a school boyhood friend was more to the point. The ugliest, most disagreeable boy you ever saw. An FBI agent who interviewed DeVoto in July of 1948 made the following observation in his report. DeVoto greeted me at the door, and I can clearly recall that he was unshaven, wearing a loose and somewhat soiled sport shirt and a pair of baggy summer slacks of a dark hue. To the FBI, DeVoto was an intellectual revolutionary, the son of a fallen away priest of the Roman Catholic Church and a shabbily dressed author known to have associations with questionable or subversive groups. There's no evidence of any association with questionable or subversive groups. None. There's none of that. He was a fierce proponent of freedom of speech. Following his graduation from high school in Ogden, Utah, DeVoto enrolled as a freshman at the University of Utah. In the spring of 1915, 2 English instructors, one of them DeVoto's teacher, were fired at the behest of a disgruntled Mormon church. As a result of their termination, 15 faculty members resigned in protest, and the American Association of University Professors blacklisted the university. DeVoto, having been accepted as a transfer student at Harvard University, headed east after 1 year of study at the University of Utah. In 1917, he enlisted in the Harvard Regiment, serving for the duration of World War I as an instructor in marksmanship. And he was a crack shot. You know, they say a lot of times marksmen are loners, and he was a loner, and he spent a lot of time in Ogden as a boy learning to shoot. He was a deadeye. After the war, DeVoto returned to Ogden, where he cared for his ailing mother and found employment as a junior high school teacher. He moved to Evanston, Illinois in 1922, where he taught in the English department at Northwestern for 5 years. He married one of his students, Helen Abbess McVicker, who would frequently prove as outspoken as her husband and known for her rather crude. Well, let's just move on with that. DeVoto joined the English faculty at Harvard as a lecturer in the fall of 1927, and having been denied to permanent status, resigned his teaching position and accepted the editorship of the Saturday Review of Literature. He became a leading critic of the Civil War revisionist historians, who for the most part were academic historians. I think we see from this time forward, you get writers like Catherine Drinker Bowen, David McCullough. I think we would all here call them popular historians, certainly not academics. We don't consider them academic historians. They're popular historians, not to demean them, but they don't come from the rigorous training of the historians that many of us have read, when we prepare these papers. And I think DeVoto fits in that group. Writes a lot. He does remind you of Catherine Drinker Bowen, I think, the way he writes. Though he lived in New England until his death in 1955, all of his writing is centered in the West, except for one book he had written on Mark Twain. For DeVoto, the West begins where the average rainfall drops below 20 inches, approximately the 100th meridian. In his essay, Footnote on the West, Harper's Monthly, November 1927, DeVoto wrote that the West is the intermountain West, the land that is dominated by the Rocky Mountains. He writes, the fact that there are no ranges called the Rocky Mountains is only a minor paradox in this holy paradoxical land. The eastern fringe of Washington and Oregon is west, but the rest of them is something else, Pacific Coast. California is not west. Decidedly and emphatically, California is not west. He writes, if Californians are Westerners, then be assured we live in the state of Maine. To our sorrow, he says, Arizona and New Mexico are not west, for they are southwest, and the Spanish and Indian civilizations separate them from us. For DeVoto, the West is mountains and desert, and they merge into one another. He wrote, men are impelled to love the countryside in which they live. Therefore, it has always seemed to me, he said, a great pathos that the love of millions of people must be expended on the monotony, the flatness, and the sameness of the Middle West. There will yet be a philosopher to explain the Middle West by its unimaginative landscape. That it is a soul-sick region is attested to by its literature. Ms. Cather, Mr. Sinclair Lewis, and lesser novelists are significantly unanimous in reporting its frustration, dullness, and spiritual insolvency. The Middle West, he said, is monotonous as a picket fence, and its beauty is only that of flat surfaces, weak colors, and the tamed and cautious order of its farms. I mean, this is how he writes. I just want to quote him liberally because I want you to get a flavor of this person. But in the West, the horizon is a line of peaks with gigantic perspectives played over by barbaric colors that are persistent fire in the mountain sun. DeVoto has written that the Western frontier has created a number of myths. One myth exhibits the West as the last great stand of American individualism. For DeVoto, nothing could be further from the truth. He writes, the West has never been individualistic. In the nature of things, no horde of individualists could have existed in the desert to which the pioneers came. Only a completely cooperative group who shared the rigors of the land and banded together to resist them could have survived. The second myth has to do with the nature of the pioneers of the West. DeVoto writes, the pioneer means to us a heroic compound of all the virtues, and chiefly of courage and intelligence. Fact is, apart from mining rushes which attracted all the less stable elements of the East indiscriminately, there were just three classes from whom the bulk of Western migration was made up. One, restless, unadjusted folk, such as old soldiers, rivermen, and roustabouts. Two, people who for one reason or another had occasion to evade the law, whether the criminal code or bankruptcy. And three, by far the largest class, those who were driven west by economic pressure, which is to say those who had found competition in the East too strenuous for them, which is further to say the unfit. The typical pioneer for him was a middle-aged chap with a half-grown family. He'd been thrown out of work by a shutdown of Eastern mills or by foreclosure of his lands. DeVoto compares the myth of the Old West to the myth of the Old South. The West, he said, has chosen to base its myth on the business that was, of all Western businesses, most unregardful of public rights, most exploitative, and most destructive. The cattle kingdom did more damage to the West, he wrote, than anything else in the economy of liquidation of resources. The West for DeVoto was a region clinging to a false mythological past, destined to be ill-prepared for coping with the difficult future, particularly conservation of its natural resources. Douglas Brinkley, who many of you have read, rates DeVoto as the preeminent conservationist writer between Theodore Roosevelt and Rachel Carson. And, with that, having read Brinkley's note, I thought, well, this will be interesting, and let's see where this goes. DeVoto's outlook on the environment is outlined in two distinct stages of his writings. The first began August 1934 with the publication in Harper's of his article, "The West, a Plundered Province." DeVoto argued that the West had always been an exploited colony, a colony of Eastern business and finance, the victim of a one-way developmental process, siphoning off Western wealth to fill the Eastern coffers. In the decades following the Civil War, the liquidation of Western resources accelerated with the arrival of the mining syndicates, lumber combines, and of course cattle empires, all financed with Eastern money and encouraged by a weak government at both state and national levels. DeVoto attacked the Stockmen's Association, the cattle and sheep ranchers who had enjoyed the privilege of grazing their livestock on public lands in exchange for minimal fees. He criticized the sheep ranchers who advocated the removal of all grazing lands from the Bureau of Land Management and redistribution of the land of the states, and ultimately to private owners at a nominal cost. The sheep ranchers further sought to have all Forest Service, talk about the U.S. Forest Service, holdings reclassified so that grazing lands inside the national forest would also be returned to the states. DeVoto argued that the cattlemen's proposed land grab, and many say that he really coined I think the term's been around a long time, but the term land grab. Proposed land grab was an attempt to liquidate the Bureau of Land Management and emasculate the Forest Service and gain ownership of a fragile domain that belonged to all Americans. For DeVoto, exploitation of the natural resources of the West was analogous to 18th century mercantilism. He wrote, "The West is to the East a source of raw materials for manufacturers and a market for manufactured goods. Like the colonies before the American Revolution, the West is denied industry." He concluded that the West has been systematically looted by the East and has always been bankrupt. And if this sounds simplistic, this is how he writes. I don't want you to think I'm gilding the lily here. Okay. DeVoto's second stage of his Western analysis appeared in Harper's in December 1946, January 1947, in two articles, The Anxious West and the West Against Itself. He now believed, this is about 10 years later, the West was no longer simply victimized. The turning point for DeVoto as a conservationist came in 1946, when he took a long car trip through the Rocky Mountains. DeVoto had been reading the works of John Muir, and he began to see the plundered province from a broader perspective than he had, 10 years earlier. He put forth a new thesis in Harper's that a schizophrenic West was destroying itself. According to Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who had accompanied DeVoto on an earlier car trip through the West in 1940, DeVoto saw the American West as a confused yet willing victim. In stage two of DeVoto's analysis, the West was an active participant in its own decline. The West, he wrote, does not want to be liberated from a system of exploitation that it has always violently resented. It only wants to buy into it. So what is to be done? DeVoto supported the New Deal's several conservation programs. The New Deal initially appeared to DeVoto as the logical culmination of the doctrine of efficiency, and he generally approved of its accomplishments. It had substituted sustainable yields for the unthinking liquidation of American resources. It checked soil erosion, helped restore rundown rural areas of the country, launched reclamation projects, and furthered economic recovery. He considered the grazing interests in their attempted, again, land grab part of a larger crisis of federalism in the years following the end of World War II. In what appeared to DeVoto to be a counter-revolutionary reaction against federal power, which had expanded, of course, greatly during the New Deal, local and regional business interests aided by a resurgent Republican Party now sought to dismantle the regulatory apparatus of the national economy. DeVoto advocated what he called the doctrine of a national commons shared by all Americans. He urged his readers to enjoy the national domain as their land belonging to all the people. The key concept for him connecting post-war consumerism and, the surge of tourism in this country. DeVoto had voted for Roosevelt in 32 and 36. He objected, however, with increasing vehemence to what he regarded as the seizure of the New Deal by its ideologues, those who felt they knew better than the ordinary man what was good for him. His objections boiled over in 1937 over the court packing bill, and also proposals for the reorganization of the executive branch of the government. And I had never read about, and I still have read very little about Roosevelt's, the court backing. We all know about that, but his attempts to reorganize the executive branch, I think they made sense. I think actually he was streamlining that, much as Richard Nixon did. I think that was one of Nixon's real accomplishments, was streamlining these the executive department, but DeVoto thought that was out of control. He became increasingly aligned, however, with the Democrat Party because the Republican Party, beginning in 1948, declared in favor of scaling back federal interference with the rights of the states and reviewing federal land policies. Both Harold Stassen and Thomas Dewey favored downsizing the Forest Service. In 1952, Eisenhower set the tone and direction of the incoming administration by calling for a new partnership between government and developmental forces as a replacement for the intrusive federal government. DeVoto was worried about the massive projects planned by the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers. The most vulnerable part of the national domain in 1950 was Dinosaur National Monument in northeast Utah, straddling the state line with Colorado. At the juncture of the Green and Yampa rivers, the Bureau of Reclamation planned to build two dams, one at Split Mountain and the second at Echo Park's Steamboat Rock. In his Saturday Evening Post article, "Shall We Let Them Ruin Our National Park?" was widely read and stirred nationwide interest in park preservation, especially when a condensed version appeared in the Reader's Digest. The legal case against the dam project was simple. By the terms of the initial National Parks Act of 1916, the parks were to be set aside in perpetuity for, quote, use without impairment. The only issue was whether constructing dams inside the parks constituted an impairment. Neither the Army Corps of Engineers nor the Reclamation Bureau thought they did, and both planned for dams inside Glacier National Park, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, as well as Dinosaur National Park. Following the election in 1952, DeVoto accused the Republican Party of ignoring its conservationist heritage, which he traced back to John Wesley Powell, Carl Schurz, and Gifford, and I never did know how to say it. Is it Pinchot?
Pinchot.
Yeah.
Pinchot.
Pinchot. Francais.
Governor of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Gifford Pinchot.
Yeah.
Who were all Republicans. DeVoto reminded readers that all of these party heroes had been devout nationalists who had emerged from the Civil War with a strong sense of national community, much as the Union had confronted the Confederacy. In his final years, DeVoto was despondent. All of his dire predictions seemed to be coming true. In his last published article, Conservation, Down and on the Way Out, which appeared in the August 1954 issue of Harper's, he offered a bleak assessment of the 1950s political situation and the prospects for the conservation movement. DeVoto died, convinced that the conservation as he knew it had been imprisoned from what he called an iron triangle made up of powerful Western congressional bloc, influential federal agencies eager for rapid development, and local interests. Wallace Stegner, DeVoto's, again, his biographer and also really his conservation disciple, credited DeVoto with converting him to environmental activism. Just as DeVoto had fought angrily against the corporations liquidating the West during the Eisenhower years, Stegner took it upon himself to check the counter-revolutionary attack on the environment building toward the Reagan administration's positions on conservation. For both DeVoto and Stegner, the new age of corporate consolidation had dimmed the vision of an alternative community, a nation in their minds held together by cooperative values, social responsibility, and collective purpose, which it called on the federal government to protect. Now, this brief summary of DeVoto's War in the West is separate and distinct from what I really consider his magisterial history of the West. And this is what I should have written my paper on, but I didn't. I just missed the boat. In Year of Decision 1846, DeVoto employed two literary techniques: synecdoche, the use of a single figure or episode to stand for a larger whole, as well as what he called simultaneousness, the braiding together of several narrative strands in order to convey the fact that they were all happening at once. DeVoto found meaning where others could not, the combination of insecurity, utopianism, and cold logic that became the willful idea of manifest destiny. He wrote to his friend and colleague, Catherine Drinker Bowen, "Ours is a story mad with the impossible. It is by chaos out of dream. It began as dream and has continued to dream down to the last headline you read in the newspaper. And of our dreams, there are two things above all others to be said: that only madmen could have dreamed them or would have dared to, and that we have shown a considerable facility for making them come true." He wrote about these dreams of madmen without sensationalizing them in the saga of the Mormons, the doomed Donner Party, and Oregon land fever. In 1846, the United States and thousands of emigrants heading west took a decisive turn. Although the great majority of Americans did not yet realize the fact, the addition of the Great West made the Civil War, the death of slavery, and the rise of a single continental nation inevitable. The United States, driven by the logic of geography, began to respond to new impulses and forces. In the future, the lines of influence and power would run east to west, not north to south. Although he's been dismissed by many academic historians, DeVoto's opinionated style of history has not gone unappreciated. Across the Wide Missouri won a Pulitzer Prize for History in 1948. The second volume of his trilogy of the West is a detailed account of the glory days and the precipitous decline of the fur trade, in which Sir William Stewart, a Scottish baronet, and Alfred Jacob Miller, an artist, had been participants and observers. Stewart and Miller witnessed the end of the fur trade in the decade before the coming of the migration to Oregon and California. From one angle, the fur traders appeared magnificent examples of frontier hardihood and courage. Yet from another angle, they seemed prisoners of the fur monopolies, which exploited them as they proceeded to destroy the beaver population. DeVoto recognized the fur monopolies as precursors of the extractive predators of the next century, the cattle corporations, mining syndicates, and lumber combines, all of which laid waste to the region. The fur traders might have been brave, but they were also uncaring agents of environmental destruction. Jim Bridger may have stood as a legendary figure in a storied past, but in another as a determined pillager, unaware of his real historical role. In his preface to Across the Wide Missouri, DeVoto explained that he aimed to describe the fur trade as a business and way of life. The process of looting the land, DeVoto believed, had begun with those mountain men who wiped out the beaver, all the while trumpeting their freedom from an over-civilized East and the capitalist monopoly that was exploiting them. Ranged against the selfish interests throughout the history of the West were the legitimate stewards of the land, those permanent settlers whose story he had told in Year of Decision. They made farms and they set up local systems of production, trade, and even manufacturing. DeVoto's trilogy of historical writing culminated in 1952 with the publication of Course of Empire, an account of westward exploration through Lewis and Clark's expedition, and that year and won the National Book Award for nonfiction that year. The grand theme of his trilogy was not simply the West, but instead the development of the continental nation. DeVoto said, "As an historian, I've interested myself in the growth among the American people of the feeling that they were properly a single nation between two oceans, and the development of what I've called the continental mind. It was this ability to see the West as part of the national whole despite its, quote, colonial, close quote, economic and political status, its myths, and its distinctive environment that allowed DeVoto to see the vast public lands of the West as a national resource, not simply a regional one. This insight, along with his passion for the landscape, lay at the root of his defense public lands. Thank you.
He spent a lot of time living in the East.
He lived his whole, he left. Well, he went to Northwestern, I think, in the 20s, and then he taught at Northwestern, and then he got a teaching position at Harvard. He was there several years, but he didn't get tenure, and he left, and I think he left. He was a little sour on the whole thing, but he really, in that way, how a lot of these, and we've all read them in our Query Club research over the years. There are these historians who, hey, I'm an historian, you're not. You're a populist. I write history. You play with it. And they, we think really. I mean, David McCullough, I think, has a real chip on his shoulder as an example of an historian who, clearly doesn't have the. He sells a lot of books, but he doesn't have the background, the training of a classical historian, much as I think. I think maybe the first one I read that I think may have had that was Alan Nevins. I don't know if you've read him. A lot of his work pre-Civil War. I think Nevins was along that line, but certainly we've all read Catherine Drinker Bowen. Her books on the Revolution and on the Constitution, and there's others who I'm trying to think of the one she wrote. She's written the Proud Tower. Barbara Tuchman. Again, she's not the classically trained historian, but she's really readable, And I think DeVoto, he fits in that class. But what I wanted to say to the group was, I don't really recommend his environmental. It's polemics. It's really extreme. I think a lot of it's true, but the way he writes, he's just so angry. He's so angry. I think it loses its not credibility, but it just comes off like he's just going to shoot you. It really comes off that way. I don't think his history does. I think his history is he's almost understated the way he writes this wonderful trilogy. And I thought when I took this, I really considered what my topic would be this year, and like all of you, I really enjoy the research. I just didn't find his writing, and most of these are articles that I read from, he published these articles over, 20 or 30 years on the environment. I didn't find them very readable. I thought they were, and maybe part of it is, stale. He's writing about environmental issues. We face the issues today, but he's writing about kind of the Stockmen's Association. It's hard to get too fired up about them. Anyway, I just had trouble getting my teeth into it. Whereas the history, I think, is good. He's also written a couple novels, and they've been panned as they're just not very good. But I haven't read those, so I'm in no position to.
Were they Westerns?
Yes, they were, Connor. And I can't really recall, Connor, if they were. If they had some oral tale, I can't really recall because I didn't read them. I read reviews of them somewhere, but not enough that it interested me in actually picking the book up. But that trilogy, I really recommend all of you. My older brother John and I were talking about this. He was in for the weekend from Detroit, and he had read 1846. Year of Decision, 1846. And he thought Across the Wide Missouri was just tremendous. You'd think, well, the beaver trade, how interesting can that be? But he really knows how to tell a story. And of course, he also, he is polemical. He doesn't come right out and say it, but this is about the destruction of the rise and destruction of the beaver in the West and the trade. And is Jim Bridger the mythical person we think he is, or is he more a tool of the Eastern trade on that kind of thing? I think he tells a really good yarn. The other thing about Across the Wide Missouri, and I should have brought the book, but I picked up. I had a paperback, and just for fun, I went on Amazon for like $2.50. I got a first edition, and it has about 100 pictures in it, and they're just fabulous. They're most of them are paintings. And they're paintings by this artist who had accompanied, he'd gone, well, let me just get his name real quick, you guys, because he's really terrific. Let's see if I can find that. Because it's an easy name, but I keep forgetting his name. He was a forgotten artist until he found these. He didn't find. I mean, he was led to these paintings, and let's see if I can find that. The artist. Yeah, I'm sorry. The artist's name was Alfred Jacob Neller. So Neller accompanied this Sir William Stewart, who was, a wealthy Scottish baronet, and he kept a diary, and then Miller draws, these paintings, paints these pictures, and I can't remember who it was, but someone came to DeVoto during World War II and said, "Hey, we've discovered in somebody's attic 100 of Miller's paintings." And no one had ever really heard of them. And DeVoto, they said, "Look, we'd like you to write a book and try to, bring these paintings together, because we do know that Miller accompanied, the Scottish baronet, and of course DeVoto, because he really was a great researcher, was able to figure out where each of the paintings in the West, where they were made. I mean, he really was good that way. I mean, I don't want you to think he was any lazy. Just like, we know David McCullough researches his books and everything. I think DeVoto really took the time. And so when you read the book, it's fun to read because every other page has a painting on it. It's a beautiful book.